Hello everyone, and welcome back to part 4 of my Kerbal Space Program tutorial. I hope you're all well and recovered from the epic mission that we undertook last episode. This episode is going to be a little bit different. We're going to look at something a little bit different. We're going to look at advanced rocket construction and extra ideas behind that. So we are going to launch a ship in this episode, but it's going to be to show you another more advanced concept for launch. So I'm afraid this is mostly book learning, but it's good book learning. So pay attention. There will be a test. Well, there won't be a test, but the test will be whether or not you can actually fly these bloody ships. Okay, so what I would like to do today is to discuss a little bit more about these parts and what these statistics mean. My goal is by the end of this episode you will have a much clearer idea of how to choose the right parts for the right mission and how to design the right rocket yourself. Because it's no good me always showing you how to construct everything, because to be quite frank, I don't want to have to show you how to build every rocket for every mission you could possibly undertake. What's the point? You might as well go out there and experiment a bit yourself. So hopefully by the end of this episode you should be able to be a lot more confident in selecting the right parts for the job and putting them together in the right way. So first of all, let's choose our Command Pod Mark 1, the good old staple. Actually no, let's mix things up and we'll use the Mark 1-2, the slightly larger one. So we're going to put this up here. And the first thing we want to look at are engines. Specifically, we want to look at the engine stats and what they mean. Now, this is important because it gives you an idea as to what the role of each engine actually is. Now, the first stat is obviously the maximum engine power. Now, the maximum engine power is pretty much what it says on the tin. It is the amount of force that engine puts out. So, for example, the mainsail, the most powerful base engine in the game, can put out 1,500, and I think this is measured in kilonewtons, I'm not certain, but either way they all use the same units, so it's a direct comparison anyway. But maximum output on that is 1,500. The LV909, however, is only 50. So, maximum engine power there 50, maximum engine power there 1,500. So why would we want to use the LV909 over the Rokomax mainsail? Well, to start off with, the Rokomax is a large engine. It is one of the larger sizes. The LV909 is a smaller one. So whereas the Rokomax is designed to fit on one of these large orange fuel tanks, the LV909 is designed to fit on one of these smaller fuel tanks. Now you can put them on the other side. In fact, I have been able to get some limited success out of using these large orange tanks with small engines on them in other circumstances. But generally speaking, it's not really recommended. You don't want to be carrying more fuel than you need, because more fuel is more weight, and if the engine isn't powerful enough to shift that weight and some more, then it's not really going to get anywhere. It's not doing you any good. So why else would we want to use the LV909 over the Rokomax? Well, the LV909, you'll notice, also has these ISP stats, as does the Rokomax. You have ISP at sea level and ISP in a vacuum. What's this ISP? Well, it means specific impulse, and basically it's a measure of how efficiently the engine converts fuel into thrust. So an engine with a high ISP is able to get more thrust out of the same amount of fuel than another engine would, of lower ISP. So this basically means that while the LV909 is not able to put as much raw power out as the mainsail, it is able to use fuel more efficiently, and that means that if built into the correct configuration, it will actually provide you with more delta V. So that tends to be the case with these smaller engines. They have a much better ISP than the high thrust engines. So why don't we use the LV909s all the way? I mean, after all, if they're that good, they're that efficient, they should get us into orbit with ease, right? Well, no, because there is another aspect that we need to look at, which is the thrust to weight ratio. However, we'll cover that in a moment, because there's a few other things I want to look at first. There seems to be some sort of huddle going on down there. I don't like it when the staff get together I think they're starting to form a union. Keep an eye on that lot. Okay, that aside, we've gone over the maximum thrust, minimum the maximum engine power, the minimum engine power, which is usually 0 except for solid rocket boosters, as you will remember from last episode. The ISP at sea level and the ISP at the vacuum, because the efficiency does change depending on whether you're in an atmosphere or not. Propellants are propellants that the engine uses, usually that's liquid fuel and oxidizer. Flame out threshold is important for jet engines, but we're not going to be looking at jet engines for a while because those are mainly for space planes. And to be quite frank, I've never really got the hang of space planes, but I am learning. Finally, there is thrust vectoring. Thrust vectoring engines mount the nozzle on a little gimbal, which means the nozzle can turn. This is helpful as it means that you have much tighter control over the rocket. You can turn the rocket more easily when the engine is firing. Combine that with an ASAS system and the rocket stays on course a lot more easily. Even if you're not using an ASAS system, it makes steering the rocket much, much easier. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is show you this. This is MechJeb. This is a very controversial mod because it automates a lot of the functions of the game. So consequently, a lot of players say, well, why don't you just put an I win button on the game if you're going to use MechJeb? Other people say, well, to be honest, the astronauts who flew to the moon didn't do it by eyeballing it the whole way. There was a lot of automation, and you still need to understand how the game works in order to actually use MechJeb properly. You can't just tell it to do what you want to do. You've got to know, you've got to input and work out the instructions and then feed it into MechJeb. I'm going to go into more detail on it in the next episode, where I'd like to discuss a few other mods that I like, but for now the important thing is that MechJeb isn't just for automation. MechJeb also provides you with very important information about your ship, which, to be completely honest, I think should be a part of the base game, but for some reason it's not. If we put the MechJeb module on the ship, you can see that we get more information about the vessel, which is very useful, and I will demonstrate what that is to you in a moment. You can download MechJeb from the Kerbal Space port, which is accessible from the game's main menu, or just straight through your web browser if you like. Just search for MechJeb and you'll find it. So, what are we going to use here? Well, next we're going to look at that thrust to weight ratio I mentioned. So if I just stick an engine on here, a mainsail, you'll see that I get some useful information popping up here. This shows you that each stage, the various stats. So we currently have one stage on the rocket, which is just big Rokomax tank and a mainsail engine. TWR is thrust to weight ratio. So this means that we are getting 3.36 units of thrust to every unit of weight. Now, if your thrust to weight ratio is 1 or lower, your rocket will not move when it is on Kerbin. Now, remember, this is thrust to weight, not thrust to mass. There is a big difference. The mass of the rocket simply measures how much of it there is. The weight of the rocket is how much of it there is combined with gravity. So, for example, if you're on the launch pad and you have a thrust to weight ratio of 0.9, your rocket will not move. It will not get off the ground. But if you are in orbit, you will still be able to get a delta V change out of that rocket. So you could, for example, get into orbit, and then your final stage once you're in orbit has a thrust to weight ratio of 0.5, and it will still be useful because you'll still be able to change the shape of your orbit with it. And this brings us back to those lower powered engines. They may not provide that much thrust, but because they burn more efficiently, they use less fuel to get the same orbit change that you would out of a larger engine, which would require more fuel to do the same change. Next up, there's the delta V. We touched on delta V in the last episode. And then there is the time. The time is the amount of fuel that you've got for a burn. So 69 seconds in vacuum. You see we've got the atmosphere stats here and the vacuum stats here. So for example, in a vacuum, we would have 3,933 meters per second of delta V, and that would last for a total of 69 seconds. So if we just put the engine on full throttle and left it there, it would be 69 seconds before we ran out of fuel, and in those 69 seconds we would expend 3,933 delta V. So what happens if I put a bit more weight on this rocket? Let's say, for example, that I want to put a hitchhiker storage container on the top. Notice how the delta V goes down. And this is because I am adding more mass to this ship. The more mass I put on it, the more work the engine has to do. The more work it has to do, the lower the delta V requirement. Well, the lower the delta V total. So the more mass I pile on without putting in more engines or more fuel, the worse it gets. So for example, I could, if I wanted to, put say a load of these fuel tanks on, and you'll notice the delta V crashes because it's carrying all this weight of extra fuel, but this fuel is not actually being pumped into this engine. If I use what we call a cross feed and attach that so that the fuel is pumped into the engine, you'll see now we're up to over 4,000 delta V. While we've put more weight on, we've put more fuel in, but we have also lowered the thrust to weight ratio, and this is important as well. Now, thrust to weight ratio is extremely important when you're on Kerbin or you're trying to escape from another planet. So say for example you're landed on the moon, you want a high thrust to weight ratio if you can. If you're landed on Kerbin, you want a high thrust to weight ratio, as that will provide you with the most efficient ascent. The quicker you can get your rocket up and away from Kerbin, the better, with the exception of terminal velocity. And terminal velocity is what we're going to end this episode on. But for now, all you really need to know is a higher thrust to weight ratio means that your rocket will accelerate more quickly. Getting your rocket as fast as you can when you're trying to escape is a good idea up to the point where you reach terminal velocity. The more weight that you put on a rocket, the less delta V that you're going to get out of the engines, unless you stick more engines on there. So for example, if I take these off and then put some of these LV T45s on there instead, you see that the thrust to weight goes up because, well, the thrust to weight goes up and also the delta V goes up as well. But thrust to weight and delta V are not one and the same. So just to demonstrate, if I take this engine off and put one of these little poodle engines on, you see the thrust to weight ratio is exactly 0.5. Let's see what happens when we try to launch. Okay, so throttle up to full and fire the engines, and we're going nowhere fast. You can see the ship is wobbling and it's probably going to fall over soon. There we go. But sadly, we didn't get anywhere. So always remember, high thrust to weight ratio when you're trying to escape the planet, but you can get away with a lower, even less than 1 thrust to weight ratio once you're in orbit. Okay, so how do we use this information to give us a better, if you will, idea as to where we're getting in the Kerbal system and how to get there? Well, first of all, let's go back to delta V for a moment. You'll see here that in vacuum I have nearly 5,000 delta V with this engine, burning over 9 minutes. If I put the Rokomax on, I've got only 3,500 delta V, and this is an example of why that ISP figure is important. You'll see the ISP in a vacuum of this engine is 390, while the ISP of the Rokomax is only 330. So I can get a lot more bang for my buck once I'm in orbit out of this smaller engine. I'll have to burn the engine for longer because the thrust isn't as high, but provided that I time my burns properly, it's a much more efficient way to get around. So next up, let's take a quick look at what we call a delta V map. I'm going to explain how this delta V map works and also how to read it, and then we will construct a ship using that delta V profile. So this is a delta V chart. There are quite a few available, but this one was created by Reddit user Jellycubes and is the one that I like the most. But if you just do a quick Google search for Kerbal delta V chart, you'll find plenty of others. Find one that you like, because they all work in pretty much the same way. So what actually is it? What does it do? What does it accomplish? Well, it's pretty straightforward. All you need to do is identify the 2 points where you want to start, where you want to finish, and then track from one to the other, adding up all the delta V amounts along the way. So let's say, for example, we just wanted to get into low Kerbin orbit. We start in Kerbin, we move up to low Kerbin orbit, and there's only this amount between the two. So it takes roughly 4.45 to 4.7 kilometers per second of delta V in order to execute that maneuver. But let's say we wanted to go to the Moon. Again, we just need to follow up and across to the Moon, adding up as we go along. So we say start with 4.7 kilometers of delta V for the orbit, add an extra 0.6 to get us up to geostationary transfer orbit, plus another 0.19 to get us to the Kerbin Moon transfer orbit, and then we just simply need to add another 0.21 to get us into low Moon orbit. Now that basically means that we need roughly 5.77 kilometers in order to get into orbit around the Moon. So does this mean that we go into a geostationary transfer orbit and then into a Moon transfer orbit? No, it doesn't. What this means is that we are executing enough delta V to reach the geostationary transfer orbit, but we're not actually entering it. Now, if you look and see move across here, you'll see there is a 0.43 kilometers per second delta V change there. That's to circularize the geosynchronous or geostationary, depending on what you want to use, orbit around the planet. So what this basically means is that will raise our apoapsis up to the altitude of a geostationary transfer orbit. It doesn't actually mean that we're going into it. So a bit further beyond a geostationary orbit is the Kerbin Moon transfer orbit. That basically means that we're expending enough delta V to raise our apoapsis up to the altitude, if you will, of the Moon. So that will get us an intercept on the Moon, and then all we need to do is expend a further 0.21 kilometers once we're in the Moon's sphere of influence, and that should be enough to actually put us into orbit around it. And then if we actually wanted to land on the Moon, it's a further 0.64 kilometers per second. Now, these also work in reverse as well, sort of. Working on reverse on these delta V charts gives you a high level estimate, as you can skip some of the maneuvers. So for example, if we work backwards from the Moon, it's 0.64, and then it's an extra 0.21, then 0.19, then 0.67. But once we reach low Kerbin orbit, we don't need to expend all that in order to actually be able to reach Kerbin again. We can just use the atmosphere and our parachutes. So that's another thing to bear in mind with these charts. Also, you'll see these little arrows indicating that aerobraking is possible in the direction that they are pointing. Aerobraking basically means that once you've entered into a planet or moon, whatever's sphere of influence, you can lower your periapsis down to the level where it is inside the atmosphere. So you'll swing around in an elliptical orbit, enter the atmosphere, and the friction of the atmosphere on your craft will lower your apoapsis, thus bringing you into a more circular orbit. Now, in many cases, it's a lot more efficient to make a couple of passes through the atmosphere to shave off some delta V, and then at your apoapsis burn to raise your periapsis out of the atmosphere, thus putting you in a stable orbit. So that's an aerobraking maneuver. At some point in the future I'll demonstrate one for you, but for now you just need to get a basic idea of what it means. So using aerobraking, it's possible to shave off some of the delta V requirements on this chart. But in short, that's how a delta V chart works. Simply choose your starting point, your ending point, and add up all of the necessary delta V changes between them. Now, for the return trips, it's obviously not quite that simple. I mean, you have parachutes and so forth as well that you can use to land on certain other planets. But at the end of the day, this is only really a guide. It's pretty accurate for the trip to somewhere, but once you get to the landing and then taking off again and getting back to Kerbin, that's where it gets a bit fuzzy. Generally speaking, though, it takes considerably less delta V to get back to Kerbin than it did to get there. But again, that's just a guide. You'll need to get out there and experiment a little in order to be able to confirm how best this works for you. Okay, so we've had a look at the delta V chart and how the delta V chart enables us to plan our trips. We've also looked at the parts list and how to read those stats, and thus we have a much better idea of what each part is best suited for. So we're going to end this episode by looking at two final elements to the ascent of your rocket: drag and terminal velocity. Once we've got those sorted, on the next episode we'll go back and we'll launch ourselves a moon rocket. Okay, so let's just build a really simple ship to start. Command Pod Mark 1. You probably know this drill by now. You've seen me build this thing a dozen times. You could probably do this in your sleep. This is our very basic standard, bog standard rocket. And let's stick a MechJeb console on there as well. Purists will hate me for this, but hang on, that's MechJeb 2.0. Let's use the original, because that's the one you're more likely to find at the spaceport. Okay, so we have a thrust to weight ratio of 3.4 with this rocket, but not really enough delta V to get into orbit. Now, there are other tricks that you can use. This just isn't enough delta V, flat out. So if we add another stage below this one, but you'll notice that parts that aren't engines have a couple of other stats. For example, the decouplers have decoupler force, which represents the force at which they shear off the parts. A high decoupler force is preferable because, well, it means that your parts are less likely to strike each other. This is especially true in orbit, where you can't rely on gravity to help with the separation. On the other hand, there's also weight considerations, or mass considerations if you want to be specific about it, impact tolerance, maximum temperature doesn't really come into it yet, but I'm sure it will in later versions. And finally, there's drag. The drag for almost every object in the game is 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, except, interestingly enough, the aerodynamic nose cones, which have a drag of 0.3. This means that with the game's current drag model, putting these on your rocket actually lowers fuel efficiency. Yeah, I worked that one out. The drag model of the game is still somewhat primitive though, and it's under development. All you really need to know about drag is that it's a pain in the arse, and it is where, when you're initially launching your rocket, a lot of your delta V will be wasted. Unfortunately, right now there's not much you can do about it. As I said, the game's aerodynamics model is currently somewhat primitive, so consequently it doesn't really do much to allow you to minimize the impacts of drag at this time. When that changes, I'll let you know. What you can have an effect on though is terminal velocity. So what is terminal velocity? Well, any object released in an atmosphere with just gravity to affect it will start to accelerate down to the ground. Skydivers will know this, as has anyone who has ever fallen over. Now, eventually, the force of the atmosphere, the friction of the atmosphere, if you will, on the falling object will equal the force of gravity. Now, this doesn't mean you stop. It means that you stop accelerating. So you'll keep accelerating, you'll be falling faster and faster and faster, but then eventually you'll start to slow down and you will reach a point where you are keeping a steady speed, which is nearly always lethal. Who am I kidding? It is always lethal. Now, why is this important to us? We're going up, not down. Well, terminal velocity works both ways. If you try to accelerate faster than terminal velocity when moving upwards, the amount of friction on the rocket increases hugely and you end up wasting considerably more delta V than you need to. Now, what do I mean by wasted delta V? Well, in a perfect world, every bit of delta V that we expend should change our speed. So if I expend all this delta V, the rocket should be moving at 3,500 meters per second. In reality, we need some of it to overcome gravity, some of it to overcome friction, some of it to steer the rocket, and these things do not go into our speed. The speed is what we're after. So I'm going to show you, using MechJeb, an example of this wasted delta V. Now, what can we do to control our terminal velocity? Well, if you want to, and you want to be really pedantic about this, or you're really a maths person, you can calculate the terminal velocity of your rocket. It's quite straightforward, really. All the terminal velocity is the square root of 10 times the gravitational constant times the mass of the planet over the square of the distance of the rocket from the center of the planet times the atmospheric pressure. Yeah, that's what I thought. You can do this, and to be honest, the equation is nowhere near as scary as I just made it sound. It's a pretty straightforward equation if you know your maths. If you don't know your maths, then you can look on the Kerbal Space Program wiki, and there is a rough and ready reckoner for the terminal velocity at different altitudes on each planet that has an atmosphere. Now, terminal velocity requires air, so obviously only planets and moons with an atmosphere will have that as an impact. To give you a rough idea of this though, up to about 1,000 meters, you're looking at 97.3 meters a second. Up to about 3,000, keep it under 130. Up to 8,000, keep it below 215. Once you get above 10,000 meters, you can actually start accelerating a little bit, get up to about 260. And after 15,000 meters, that's when you really start to actually get some acceleration. You can get up to 425 meters per second. So, again, check that table on the website. I'm going to put a copy of it up here whilst we're ascending as well. But that's close enough for most people. Unless you're building exceptionally huge rockets or extremely tiny rockets, it's close enough for field work. Now, with MechJeb, we meant to make sure that the Ascent Autopilot is engaged. We can leave it on its default settings because we're not actually doing much here, and then just click Engage. We then press space to lift off. Now, I don't normally automate these things for the tutorials because I think it's important that you understand how this works, but unfortunately this Ascent Stats, which you can make sure you can see by checking the stats box here, will only work if MechJeb is controlling the flight. So I launch, and you see the ship immediately accelerates and then pulls back on the throttle because it's pretty much at terminal velocity for that altitude. And if you look here, you can see the percentages as to where our delta V is going. So we've expended 500 delta V nearly at this point, but our speed has only changed by about 130 now. But if you can see here, gravity and drag are taking huge quantities of our delta V. Only 20% roughly of the delta V that we're putting out is actually going into changing our speed. We're getting less than 20% efficiency. However, this is because we are in the thickest section of the atmosphere, and we are also still damn close to Kerbin. Now, the closer you are to Kerbin, the more the gravity will affect you. So the further away you get from Kerbin, the lower the impact of the gravity. Likewise, the higher we get in the atmosphere, the thinner the atmosphere gets, the lower the drag. So the amount of speed that we gain will start to increase as we get further from Kerbin and further out of the atmosphere. And you can see already that the speed gaining is increasing considerably. You see, we're out of the thickest part of the atmosphere. We're getting further from Kerbin. The amount that we're losing to gravity and the amount we're losing to drag is decreasing hugely. We've lost a little bit to steering, but right now you can see that the speed gain is getting much more efficient. Let me check the map screen. You can see the apoapsis has now actually hit the required point. Obviously we're going to run out of fuel shortly. I don't think we're not going to make it into orbit, but this gives you an idea as to what the ascent looks like. At the end of the day, check the table, try and stick to the table, because otherwise the drag losses are going to be much bigger. Now ideally what I'd like to do is, actually I think I can take off the auto throttle, so if I restart this flight, what I'll do is take off the auto throttle, engage, and then just fire this whole thing up with full throttle. So now you'll be able to see that our drag losses are going to go up considerably. So we're now over terminal velocity. We're now working much harder against the atmosphere than we need to. Drag losses are going up considerably. You can see drag losses pushing up to 50%. So while our speed goes up and we might get out of the thickest part of the atmosphere earlier, we're just expending a lot more delta V to do it than we gain by getting out of that atmosphere sooner. And you'll see shortly as well. And see drag losses are now at over 50%. We've lost a huge quantity of fuel doing very, very little. You see, we're moving so fast we're getting re-entry effects even though we're inside the atmosphere. That's quite funny. Sorry, no, even though we're inside the atmosphere. Even though we're leaving the atmosphere rather than coming back in. And there we go, we're out of fuel. We managed to get the apoapsis. Yep, we just got it there, but unfortunately we've wasted too much fuel. So that's why it's important to consider these things. But anyway, as I say, next week we're going to put all this together. We're going to construct ourselves a moon rocket. We're going to do a Mooner flyby, not necessarily a landing, but we're going to do a flyby. And that will be another important milestone for you. So there was a lot to digest in this video. I recommend that you grab yourself a cup of tea if you're British or whatever the American equivalent is, or equivalent of wherever you are in the world. I know I've got a few people out there who aren't in Britain or in America. Not many, but there's a few. Either way, grab your beverage of choice, ponder what we've learned in today's episode, and possibly look back over previous episodes to put it all into context. And I'll see you next time. I'm Evis T, signing off.